Hello everyone! I know it's been quite some time since the last entry into this series, and now that we're about halfway through, I'd like to share my central thesis as I walk through the last of the examples I set out to discuss. Examples of what, you might ask? Well, it might surprise you to hear this, but this is not a video series about how The Last Jedi is secretly a good film. I think on some levels it is better than the other two sequel trilogy films, although that's a very relative remark. But I am and have always been open to negative reviews of films I personally rate higher than others or enjoy despite everything. In fact, I've encountered what I felt was some decent critique of the Star Wars films in general by critics who didn't like any of them. And not even the ones made by Lucas, not even the original trilogy. And I can respect that even if I personally don't feel the same way. No, it isn't negative reviews of The Last Jedi that bother me. The purpose of creating this video series has very explicitly been to articulate why, in particular, there was such a strong movement of hatred for this specific film, what the effects of that movement were, and the conspicuous nature of the beliefs emergent in this online space as a result. What is odd to me is how bad many of the arguments forwarded by YouTube critics about this film were and have been. Certainly not all of them were poorly articulated, illogical, inconsistent, or lacking in evidence or a strong familiarity with the source material, but some of them were, and in fact they did so to the tune of a gushing fountain of positive feedback and millions of views, buoying the careers of several YouTubers who now dominate that space. It would be odd, then, if so many views expressed in the process were faulty, as I've alleged, and so far I think I've managed to point to a few critics and their videos that did a very poor job of criticizing this film. Maybe, after the 9th installment of this series concludes, I'll eventually come back and make my own Last Jedi essay, or talk about some of the essays by other creators that I think do make many more good points, but I have a point to make here, and it's time I progress towards it. So, without any further ruminations on our raison d'etre, let's look at our 5th example of a type of faulty reasoning deployed in criticizing The Last Jedi. Today we'll be looking at a creator called Robot Head, and this should be a blast from the past for old fans of the channel, but I want to take his work a little more seriously than I have when I talked about it in the past. I think he does most of his work as a critic using snark and mean-spirited aloofness, but if you watched the previous parts of this series, you'll know we've already traced that tradition in online geek and fandom culture, so we're going to try to filter through most of his arguments to get down to brass tacks. The first of the two videos I'd like to focus in on is called Star Wars: The Last Jedi Bombers, the Worst Spaceships Ever, and it's rather in line with a certain amount of the material we've watched previously in part 3 of this series.
Some viewers disagreed. Some even liked the whole video except for the criticism of the bombers. Yeah, you're clearly talking out of your ass. The bombs were magnetised. This franchise has outer space wizards, but the bombs are a what the fuck moment to you. The shit got some sort of gravity and they got dropped. Where else were they supposed to go, then down? But you're all cool with it when a Y-Wing does a bombing run. There is gravity within the ship and the bombs are inside the ship. When they are inside of the bombing ship and are released, they begin to fall. Once they fall outside of the ship, they continue to fall because of momentum. Gosh, the bombs are fucking magnetic for the 100th time. Great video, but including the dumb bombs don't make sense argument really discredits the whole thing. Magnets work in zero gravity, dipshit. Let me explain. First, and to me, this is a big one, none of those explanations are shown in the film. A film should try to avoid raising questions that have stupid answers.
Now, if you're not familiar with Robot Head, you're probably wondering where I keep managing to find the men with the most grating accents on planet Earth. I mean, first Shadiversity, then the Critical Drinker, now this guy? I swear not everybody from these countries sounds like this. Please bear with me. In all seriousness, I don't respect Robot Head's comment here at all. I don't know why he would just lie to his audience's face like that unless he thinks they're stupid. In the film, one of the characters who turns out to be Rose's sister actually falls while in the ship. This is more or less consistent with how we've seen physics work in past Star Wars films, where characters have to be careful of large heights or can be jostled around and fall over even in a smaller ship. The ships effectively have had gravity inside of them since A New Hope, and this is shown in the films, by virtue of the fact that the characters don't just float through the ships like astronauts, but instead walk around inside of them. Because it's shown to us using the visual language of the film that the bombers do have gravity inside, the bombs falling while still inside the ship makes sense. And the comment that pointed this out wasn't pointing to something that isn't shown in the film like Robot Head says, it was pointing to something that is actually very directly shown in the film. It's not a matter of not being shown, and the fact that he insisted on that, despite being corrected, shows a lack of loyalty to the facts of the case within the context of the film. If you rewatch the scene, you'll see what I'm talking about. The bombs falling in space make sense if they're continuing at the velocity which they left the bomber. We'll come back to this again in a moment. What's more interesting is why Robot Head felt the need to make this video. I've observed a lot of poorly articulated, illogical, and downright awkward condemnations of this film in this video series, and one thing that tends to unite them is that we're dealing with people who aren't necessarily well-versed in film as a craft, or at least they don't behave like it in terms of how they construct their points. So they don't tend to comment on material relating to that, but they do feel the need to comment on every other thing. Not an element of the film goes by when these guys don't have a condemnation seemingly, which is interesting, because it comes off like another inheritance of the rage review genre, only they act like they really believe in it. It worked when other reviewers from previous eras did it, in my opinion, because a lot of the time the rage was part of the charm, and it was all in good fun. They didn't necessarily really hate literally every moment of everything they watched, but now a lot of YouTube reviewers are just like this, just cinema sins plus snark, and it seeps into everything they do. The bombers don't actually need to be bad for the film to be bad, logically speaking. In reverse, demonstrating that there are ways in which the bombers or some other element of the film makes sense, or at least aren't bad specifically for the reasons a YouTuber told you, doesn't make the film good or mean that you don't have perfectly justifiable reasons for not liking it or reviewing it negatively. I hope that stands as a point on its own, in fairness for the record. Robot Head says the films should try to avoid raising questions that have stupid answers. I think stupid people tend to mainly give stupid answers to questions raised by films, so coming from him, that's a moot point. Again, we see the trend of the critic making their own lack of curiosity and intellectual rigor somebody else's problem. Think my thoughts for me, why won't you, Rian Johnson, if you really are such a good director.
Plus, I said they were illogical. Logical and possible are two different things. And I wasn't just talking about the bombs dropping, I was talking about the whole stupid design of the bombers. Everything about them, speed, maneuverability, design. Just because something could possibly work doesn't make it a logically good choice. I said they were illogical, not impossible. It's possible for me to pick a fight with Mike Tyson. Would it be logical to do so?
So, setting aside that Robot Head did directly insinuate that the film does not show how the bombs were possible, which it does, he's also concerned with whether using the bombers was a logical choice for the Resistance, and whether their design is logical for the people who built them. After all, we all remember how there's a plot beat in this film concerning the war profiteers who benefit from the companies that sell weapons and technology to both the Resistance and the First Order. Since the film wants to bring up the idea of a galactic military-industrial complex explicitly in the text, Robot Head is right to put things in that context. This is good. One of the things that sticks out to Robot Head later in his video is the way the bombers approach the Dreadnought. They're moving at that point as fast as the X-Wings in the shot, but of course the X-Wings and A-Wings can obviously move faster, so it's not that the bombers are actually fast, but logically they have to be moving in a certain way at a certain effective range with a massive payload during the bombing runs specifically. Robot Head understands this, and while the bombers aren't necessarily on a suicide mission if they don't meet resistance, the only one that gets through also gets destroyed in part because it's taken damage, and in part because it doesn't have anyone left to pilot it away in time. Rose's sister barely gets the bombs to deploy, and if you recall the experience of watching the film, the dramatic tension in the bombing run comes from the relative vulnerability of the bombers and speed of the fighters. The Resistance are also outnumbered, and this feature of heroic sacrifice against impossible odds continues to be a theme that the film plays with, presumably because Rian Johnson wants to say something about it. But we already talked about that theme in previous videos. We're talking about whether the bombers are logical. Possible? Maybe in some ways, although there's other aspects of Star Wars that we see here, like big fiery explosions in the vacuum of space that might not be quite as realistic or possible. Nevertheless, we'd be doing Robot Head's video a disservice if we didn't think about why the bombers might make sense in the context of the world of Star Wars. He brings up something interesting about how the technology of the bombers appears to be a kind of devolution from the previous eras of the Star Wars universe. And I have to say, I think this doesn't really make the point he thinks it's making. For one thing, this is as much an indictment of the prequels as anything. If your expectation was that technology should look more futuristic by our standards as time in Star Wars moves forward. It might also be an indictment of the original trilogy. He outright says something like this at one point, looking at the specific way that he thinks technology quote-unquote stopped moving forward. This is something people have brought up in relation to the technology of the prequels looking more slick than the original trilogy, but I think it's a misconception. First of all, if we're talking about logic, it's straight up illogical to assume that across all history, even in a fantastical setting, technology can only become more efficient and more effective from year to year. I don't think this is a problem with the prequels and the original trilogy. This might seem vaguely kind of rational as an assumption if you step back and squint from Bronze Age to Iron Age and so on to the atom bomb, but it doesn't make so much sense when you're dealing with specific periods of time, with complex economic relations. For starters, we know sometimes technology that is in some ways straight up qualitatively worse than it has to be is produced in real life. Why is that? Well, in our economy, to take one example, things like planned obsolescence create opportunities for companies to make money while pushing an inferior product. Internet infrastructure in many places in the world is suffering even now because it's a private service and there's so little competition. The company that provides internet to our home is essentially ripping us off constantly by providing a terrible service with constant outages and poor performance. And when we called to complain just recently, you know what they told us? They said we could pay more for a package that gave us priority, which of course feels a lot like giving them more money because they decided to screw us over. You see, in some ways, inferior technology is advantageous, but to who? We can surely imagine things like this occurring a dozen different ways in Star Wars, but Robot Head myopically assumes that the bombers are illogical because, like fighting Mike Tyson, it wouldn't be in their interest. But again, whose interest? We're talking about people dying for a cause here, so clearly survival isn't what they personally choose to see as their greatest interest. But that's all right, because they probably didn't build the bombers. I mean, I guess some of them could be former engineers who joined the Resistance, but you never know. The bombers could easily be repurposed technology deployed by a resistance that's on its last legs, making desperate gambit after desperate gambit. Maybe these bombers were never intended to be used specifically in this way, or maybe they have faults because in some ways they're cheaply produced, and therefore affordable by the underdog in this conflict. There could be a dozen reasons why the bombers are perfectly logical in the context of their own universe. But Robot Head forces a very limited frame of view on the conversation that prevents that more interesting discussion. I'm not saying any of those observations are themselves the capital T truth. I'm just saying there's a deliberate avoidance of the possibilities here. Alright, you saw this all coming. It's time to revisit an old classic. The other video we'll be looking at is called Disney Doesn't Understand Lightsabers, and it's a straight up banger. Let's have a look.
For a start, I'm going to jump to the one thing that gets my little George Lucas fan club blood boiling. It's a lightsaber, not a laser sword. Sorry, Last Jedi defenders, I know this fits perfectly with space wizards.
The Star Wars lightsaber.
The Force lightsaber.
Star Wars lightsaber.
New Star Wars lightsaber.
Force action lightsaber.
Star Wars electronic lightsaber.
The Force unleashed lightsaber.
I saw your laser sword. Only Jedis carry that kind of weapon.
I assumed little Anakin called it that because he lived on a shithole in the middle of nowhere and had heard about the Jedi and legend. Kind of like me pronouncing nunchucks and guessing which martial art they go with. Nunchucks? Something like that.
I'm gonna walk out with a laser sword and face down the whole First Order.
Why would Luke call it that? He has been told it's a lightsaber his whole life.
Your father's lightsaber.
A new lightsaber. His lightsaber.
Ah, yes. A Jedi's weapon.
Is that a laser sword, Johnny? No, it's a lightsaber, you stupid fuck. This is why no one likes you.
Yes, it's a fucking lightsaber, you twats. Some have said Luke called it a laser sword to show Rey how stupid the idea of him helping was. It worked. It sounded stupid. Hang on, that's what he ends up doing anyway. Oh well.
This type of thing is why I genuinely think a lot of these YouTube critics are operating in something resembling bad faith. Robot Head affects the posture of someone who thinks Luke calling the lightsaber a laser sword makes no sense. Then, when he's done making that point, he acts like it could make sense, but only because acting that way allows him to also make the point that another scene makes sense. As a buy your logic argument, this could work, but he acts like he really believes both of those things. If Luke calling the lightsaber a laser sword genuinely would not make sense for his character, then it isn't a problem for the ending, and we would need another explanation for why he does that. Presumably, this would lead us to conclude that Luke is in a bad position in the scene where he does so. Hang on, we looked at that exact scene in the Critical Drinker video, in part 2 of this series. Man, it's almost like I thought this all through in advance, that's crazy. In that scene between Luke and Rey, Luke has this emotional response to Rey making this big ask of him because he just found out Han died. He, of course, hadn't sensed this in the way that Leia would have due to being cut off from the Force in the way he was. This is all in the movie, by the way, like it's the direct implication of specifically what we see said and done on screen in this film, and the previous film. We see, in a later scene when Luke and Rey fight, that Luke begins tapping into the Force again. This is after he agreed to give her just a few lessons in order to try to change her mind, even as she was trying to change his. Therefore, because this is a movie with dynamic characters who develop over the course of the plot in ways we can see and hear, not that you'd know that watching some of these YouTubers, Luke obviously has an important change of heart. When would this have occurred, specifically? Did the writers and director forget to show it? Nope. It's in the scene with Yoda and the tree that we talked about in part 3. I needed to build on an understanding of some of those other scenes so that I could point out why Robot's Head logic here is so terrible. When Luke mocks Rey, obviously he's doing that because at that point, he hasn't changed his mind yet. They haven't even had their lessons yet. That scene follows Luke reuniting with Chewbacca after shutting the door on Rey. It's true that Luke is making fun of the idea of him swooping in to take on the whole First Order, which in a sense he doesn't actually do, because he doesn't kill any of them, but instead fights with them to stall them so the Resistance can escape. He's choosing to act, but specifically in a way that allows him to also choose nonviolence. We see him hand the dice from the Falcon to Leia, which means Luke and the things he holds can be touched if he so wishes, even though he's projecting his presence from many systems away in the Force. It seems reasonable to me to conclude that he could have killed Kylo Ren but chose not to. It actually reminded me a lot of the scenes from the old post-Episode 6 expanded universe in Legends, where Luke fears that he became tainted with the dark side after killing Lumia. One thing I was a bit disappointed by is that Disney Star Wars weren't that much like the great stuff we got in Legends, so when we do get little homages here and there, I always appreciate them. Instead of fighting, Luke dodges away and talks to Ben instead. In a sense, he chooses a third path, which is very Skywalker of him, I think. This is a different version of Luke from what we expected, but an interesting one. When he's just found out that Han is dead, however, obviously he's in emotional anguish. I remember talking in part 3 of this series about how Mauler said he wished Luke had reacted more to Han's death, and we do actually see some of that come out in this exchange. Come to think of it, the Critical Drinker said the same thing. These guys really do just regurgitate the same handful of poorly thought out arguments, huh? Luke comes off as bitter because his best friend is dead. Han saved Luke's life more times than he could probably count, and he's dead, and he didn't even get to feel him go. Someone he never met had to tell him. That hits hard, so of course he mocks her. She's giving him some of the worst news of his life and then asking for favors. A little biting remark makes sense from a writing perspective. It would be weirder if he didn't say something marginally like that. Not to reiterate what my podcast co-host has said elsewhere, but it does tend to feel like some people got a certain idea of who Luke was and who he was going to be in their head, and therefore they weren't receptive to new ideas. I get liking the older material, even preferring it, but to reject newer ideas purely because they're different feels to me fundamentally toxic to art and open discussion. With fans like these, who needs haters? It's like people have developed a toxic relationship with fictional settings and characters to the point that their real-life behavior has become maladjusted. That's actually what part 2 of this series was about, by the way, if you haven't watched it. Anyway, we can't spend forever on this, but I think this is just a silly thing to harp on if you're acting in good faith.
Finn's going to take on Kylo, a trained Jedi? Isn't Kylo just going to... Right! Oh, good. Oh, no, hang on. He's going to fight it out. Just put any other Force user that is trained with a lightsaber in Kylo's place, and it's ridiculous that Finn isn't beaten instantly. But we'll ignore that for a second. I'd been on board for most of this movie, but the first real sign I had that this was a Disney movie was this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it went. It was more like this. Oh, sorry, that's not really how it A lightsaber just went straight up the middle of his body and...
'Tis but a scratch. A scratch?
We have seen limbs flying off since 1977, but now you can be hit with one, somehow knocked out, and not be split in two. They actually filmed a scene where Poe had sewn up his jacket. That was the damage that was done. Look at Finn, he's fine.
Every time I write one of these videos about The Last Jedi, I always transcribe the quotations from the segments of the videos that I show in my videos so that I can get the wording in front of me and find the exact timestamps where certain things were said. As I do this, I look back and try to isolate the arguments that the YouTuber in question makes. I've noticed a few things about Robot Head while doing this for this video series. For starters, the main constant in his style of argumentation is that when he doesn't really have a point, he just makes observations smugly. He isn't dedicated to the interpretation contained within the smug observation, and as we've already observed, he'll contradict it at will. In Part 3, I called this Setsuna sophistry, but as we've previously discussed in Part 4, the tonality and behavior is a holdover from a previous era of media critique, so part of what's going on here is that Robot Head has the ability to advance arguments that are analytically mutually compatible, but emotionally cathartic for the audience. I'd say for himself as well, except that would require an extraordinary amount of cognitive dissonance on his part. That's not impossible, but I think the position that requires fewer assumptions is just that he's comfortable behaving like this, and might even think that being smugly rude for fun and for profit is just how the sausage is made, where film critique is concerned. If this is intentional, that implies some kind of malice or grift, a phenomenon we'll cover in later parts of this series, but we don't have to assume that. A lot of people are just lazy or uninformed, at least some of the time. It could also be both, because affecting detachment could make doing this purposefully feel more acceptable to the person doing it. What I did notice is that Robot Head recommitted to this observation by saying something similar when Rey slashes Kylo's face. As humorous as it is that Robot Head made an entirely illogical and ignorant video where he effectively said, "That's not a lightsaber, this is a lightsaber," in full obnoxious YouTuber enunciation, I have to say, this is the worst of the bunch. We've looked at a lot of videos about The Last Jedi so far that are focused around terrible arguments made in service of condemning it, its director, or Disney Star Wars media in general, and I have to say that of the technically 6 videos that we've looked at so far, this one is a contender for the most egregious. Sure, watching someone like the Critical Drinker outright lie about the film is pretty bad, but I think Robot Head is delivering consistently on the general formula laid out in shakier form by the whole bunch of them. And he argues mainly from a detached smugness that makes it clear he isn't really committed to a position except whatever allows him to be negative about the film. I'm not exactly sure if this is better or worse than lying, because it's a posture of bad faith that makes it impossible to treat him as if he sincerely believes in anything, but it's definitely a troubled framing for the discussion of the film. I actually made a video about this video previously, and it wasn't very well made, but it did invite some feedback from Robot Head's audience. I recall making the specific point that we know for a fact that lightsabers can be highly disabling even when only a minor cut has occurred, and that lightsabers can manage such smaller cuts, as we see Count Dooku inflict 2 such cuts on Obi-Wan in Attack of the Clones. Robot Head's videos set up the prequels as iconic entries into George Lucas's universe, and I agree with that. But interestingly, I got one funny comment from his fans over and over back when I talked about this video the last time. They frequently said something to the effect of, "Actually, you don't know what you're talking about because Dooku wasn't trying to kill Obi-Wan." That's a great response, and it always made me laugh to see how silly people like this can be. First of all, if you really agree with Robot Head, you'd have to drop that defense pretty quickly, because that's not in the theatrical release of the film, which, if you recall, was his argument about the bombers, only I'm actually correct when I point that out about Dooku's intent. This information comes from extra-textual sources mainly, in particular the Matthew Stover novelization of Revenge of the Sith, which is a beautiful piece of literature which I own and have read many times. So, if Robot had believed in his own razor for how films should be constructed, and maintained his own beliefs about lightsabers in good faith, he'd have to condemn Attack of the Clones before saying anything about Disney. I wouldn't, but I don't believe in his goofy nonsense. Secondly, and this is the big one for me, that hypothetical counter in no way disproves the observation. All it would imply is that Kylo was toying with Finn, being tempted into an egotistical confrontation, attempting to cause him extreme pain, having fun, and enjoying the fight before it ended, or trying to take him alive. If one of those things were happening, and in the novelization of The Force Awakens one of them is, then this scene is perfectly logical. Once again, we see an odd error in Robot Head's reasoning, and in that of some members of his audience, who presumably aren't all that silly, except for maybe some overly vocal and defensive people. The conspicuousness of the consistency of this line of reasoning from Robot Head and others has caused me to try to come up with the language to describe this way of thinking as a pattern of psychology. When a critic condemns a new piece of media, on the basis that it is an entry in a series with a particular set of world-building mechanics or histories or what have you, and appears to have introduced a new idea that could threaten to complicate a previously established sense of internal coherence, this is when a work of art has the potential to become intrusive or obstructive to its environment. When a series develops in this way, either by breaking from its previous themes in a deeply discordant way, or otherwise introducing concepts that detract from previous ones, it is sometimes said to have jumped the shark. This idiom has its origin in an episode of Happy Days where the Fonz actually jumps over a real shark, or so I'm told. Oddly enough, as far as I'm aware, the show went on to perform relatively well, but it was a strange standout moment, and the phrase would come to indicate a moment in a piece of media, specifically a series, where something so eye-catchingly discordant with the series thus far occurs, often breaking from the previous material in a way such that there's no coming back. What's difficult for some of these YouTube critics making all this negative content about Star Wars and many other series is that they constantly have to insinuate that there's some sort of shark jumping going on in tons of series, and at multiple points. A reasoned critic might think comparatively about different points in, say, Disney's Star Wars trilogy, and look at different moments to find the one in particular where Star Wars jumped the shark. However, this process would involve retroactively looking back at the films, or any other series or show they're talking about when applying this logic, and choosing to proclaim some moments as more problematic than others. Videos like those by Robot Head and so many similar YouTubers can manage to be rhetorically successful by being less analytically rigorous, not more so, because they never have to be absolutely nailed down on a single shark-jumping moment. In other words, the mentality of the creator has to be ordered around prioritizing denouncing a new piece of media first, and finding a good reason second. The posture is what matters because it's what maintains audience engagement for channel growth, which has a financial incentive, and allows the criticism to be low effort, because if one thing doesn't convince you, another thing might. This in turn engenders the popularity of unprincipled creators who will say anything as long as it doesn't violate their prime directive. Sorry for the Star Trek reference, I know we're talking about Star Wars. Because this behavior is occurring in particular within geek fandoms, the why of which will become important later, the arguments that are appealing to geeks like us come to have a great deal of cultural currency and rhetorical appeal. Appealing to lore, suspension of disbelief, and world-building are obviously some of the greatest of these. In order to advance arguments against any new thing or new execution of an old thing by portraying it as a shark-jumping moment from ships to sabers, these YouTubers deploy a particular line of argumentation whereby the new work of art is incapable of setting its own precedent. There can't be a specific reason why something works in the film that might not have happened before, an explanation for why the new thing is compatible, because it is treated as if it's incapable of setting its own precedent. Because the new work is implicitly limited in this way, it becomes a shark jump by default, regardless of the logic implicit in it or evidence provided by it. It therefore necessarily cannot work on its own terms, existing itself in isolation with no agency, and comprised entirely of smaller elements, always treated themselves in isolation and without that agency. This pattern of thinking is faulty because it can be applied selectively anywhere the critic wants for any reason, regardless of circumstance, provided it operates as stated. It also tends to involve an appeal to tradition. I call this line of reasoning Holdo Maneuvering, for the relevantly named scene in The Last Jedi featuring Laura Dern. To end things, I'll explain how this concept works in that case. The Holdo maneuver could theoretically be a shark jump if it implicitly endangers the continuity and premises of previous ship-to-ship space combat in Star Wars. The argument goes, if they could just do this, why wouldn't they? But this isn't a strong logical condemnation, because if the movie were taken as is, the implication would be the reverse. There must be a reason why this worked this one time. What are the facts? Well, outside the film, the REDUX is a ship of especially large size, with a unique set of characteristics, including the experimental shields that wouldn't be feasible for smaller ships to have. In the language of cinema, the special qualities of the REDUX are conveyed not through dialogue or narration or description, but mainly through its name, referring to a former admiral in the Rebel Alliance, its plot significance as the flagship of the fleet, and its size. None of these literally explain why the Holdo maneuver works, but they don't have to, because in the language of film, the movie is showing you that it works by setting up those elements, including the durability of the shields of the REDUX, which is the real factor. The REDUX achieves a special status in the narrative, implying the ship itself could be special if it can achieve special feats. The REDUX achieves a special status in the narrative, implying the ship itself could be special if it can achieve special feats, which it does. Yet because the film doesn't over-explain this to the audience, instead trusting them to pick up the pieces of the implication, some of these critics just won't accept it. This is exactly what I mean by not being allowed to establish a precedent. The thing in the film is possible because the film is canon. Therefore, any concerns about the canon implications come after, not before whether the thing itself is logical. It could be a shark-jumping moment if there was no justification, only there is, except that this will be tactically ignored by petty YouTube critics following their prime directive as explained previously, and that, my friends, is Holdo maneuvering. With that, I'll have to leave you for today, but tune in again soon for more media analysis and videos about media analysis, and videos about media analysis, and other things that probably nobody asked for. Leave a like if you liked it, leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more, share with your friends, and I'll see you next time for part 6, where things take an unfortunate turn.